Wheel of Genre, the show for readers whose yo mama jokes have slipped into the literary and surreal. Right now, we are reading every story in Ann and Jeff VanderMeer's The Weird Anthology, including this one, Jamaica Kincaid's My Mother. I'm Zach, and this week I am this is my first time reading Kincaid, so all this is new to me, but the dynamic between her and her mother is maybe the real story here.
Sister is my mother now, brother. I'm Bob. I'm interested in, I guess, the nature of these transformations, how we've seen so many dream-like, not just stories about dreams, but how we've seen stories that feel constructed like dreams. And it feels like the transformations and their weird associations and their kind of like dynamic between mother and daughter, these kind of getting angry at each other moments, link to the kinds of transformations that are happening. So I'm interested in the link between the metaphor and then the whatever psychology is going on at the same time.
So Jamaica Kincaid, really interesting. She's from Antigua. This story, My Mother, is from her very first collection called At the Bottom of the River. Of course, we're reading the anthologized version of it, but I was reading summaries of all the other stories or prose poems, however you want to call them, in this, and I'd actually be really interested in reading that collection because it seems like, it seems like every single one of them is involving a mother-daughter relationship in a very strained, kind of traumatic way. I was reading some excerpts and pretty brutal stuff sometimes, but I did manage to watch an interview with her, and this was really interesting to me. In 1973, she changed her name from Elaine Potter Richardson to Jamaica Kincaid. And she did this because she didn't want her stories to be published under her own name because she wanted them to be published under a name in which she could write about the topic she wanted to write about, which was her childhood, her traumatic childhood, without her mom finding out about it. So we'll talk about the story, of course, but like the thematic of this story is this through line that's running through her whole life to the point of where she's picking up an identity, picking up a pen name, picking up a persona, that the reason for that has to do with the very same reasons in which the very same things that the story was written. And I just have one anecdote before I pass the mic off to you, which was, at the time of her interview, which was very late in her career, she still maintained a relationship with her mother, which I thought was very interesting. Having read so much and looked around so much, I was like, oh, their relationship must be so strained. No, they call each other on the phone, they chat. And the mom was like, well, despite, and by the way, she, old, this is late career. The mom was like, despite how you feel about me, it all worked out for the best. And Jamaica Kincaid said, Mom, you cannot take credit for my success. So,
wow.
Yeah. So, that's running through the background of this. It's incredible to me. It's really, really fun.
Well, this story seems to be similar to, I guess we can't say it necessarily mirrors any of that, but it does feel like it's almost like a dance between mother and daughter here of getting really angry at each other and then reconciling. And then that reconciliation or lack of reconciliation becomes this weird transformation. So there's really no context. It's just mother and daughter. Something happens to them. Either mother gets really, 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 really tall, like as tall as a skyscraper, and then daughter gets almost as tall as the mother. And then we move on to another different kind of transformation. One transformation might be more like they're turning into lizards. She starts to grow these scales. There's another transformation of just turning into, they become shadows. And so they are interacting whilst they're just sitting on the bed, and then all of their shadows are interacting. And then it seems like their shadows have changed the actual people. It's just weird, like, okay, things are almost okay, and then a turn into a completely other reality. Things get almost okay again, and a turn into a completely other reality. It reminds me a little bit of the scene in Everything Everywhere All at Once, where it's mother and daughter, but it's clip after clip after clip after clip. Now they're rocks. Now they're in the future. Now they're in the past. it reminded me a lot of that, where you cannot really ever get what you're looking for. You can't get that reconciliation. You can't get that. You can't move on. You just turn into something else.
And that it's that lack of reconciliation, that lack of, I don't know, satisfaction. I don't know what the right word I want to use here is, but like, I think that, I mean, think of the quintessential like metamorphosis book, like Ovid's Metamorphoses, you know, like things change, people change into animals, animals change into other things, gods change into animals, but there's never like an emotional undercurrent to that, or at least if there is, it's not really well conveyed or well fleshed out in ancient literature. But here, you know, I'll just read a quote. I had grown big, but my mother was bigger, and that would always be so. With every fantastical transformation that happens here, there is an emotion running under it. And there's a sense in which, like, what we're reading, I think, is autobiography, but it's not an autobiography of real events. It's an autobiography of real emotions.
Mm-hmm. That's what it feels like. Maybe, again, who knows how much we can really read into it, but it does feel like that, an exploring a relationship through crazy, what would you even call this? Like absurdism, magical realism, surrealism. It is linkages between these images. Here is one, I'm just going to quote, you quoted a great one about the tall growing bigger, but there's one where they enter the cave and it's just weird, finding weird things to emphasize. It feels a lot different from the other transformation stories we've had in the weird, like axolotl or salamander. This feels like once we get the turn, we get another turn immediately after. It says, "My mother and I now entered the cave. It was the dark and cold cave. I felt something growing under my feet and I bent down to eat it. I stayed that way for years, bent over eating whatever I found growing under my feet. Eventually, I grew a special lens that would allow me to see in the darkest of darkness. Eventually, I grew a special coat that kept me warm in the coldest of coldness." So there's all of these, I guess, little successes, little tiny transformations that allow them to adapt to a place. But then that whole place and the two people inside of it will together transform again, because soon after they become something completely different.
So I guess the question for me is, how does this fit into the weird? Because, you know, in my mind, like, transformations are not all that weird. You know what I mean? They're surreal, they're mythic, but it doesn't quite hit the same way as like weird fiction tends to hit. You know what I mean? I don't know. What do you think? Like, is it the transformative aspect itself that's weird about this, or?
I was wondering too, because again, we have read the salamander, we've read the axolotl. Axolotl, we were thinking, okay, this is a transformation story, but it feels weird because it's the experience of like staring into something, a very real world experience of looking at something, losing your own, I guess, subjectivity, because now you become the thing you were just looking at. So you kind of lose your own individuality. The salamander, we weren't sure if it was weird or not, because it also feels like the pursuit of someone, the kind of bullying of someone through weird fairy tale elements. This one feels like it's just weird, but I don't know if it's weird fiction. And in the introduction to the Weird Collection, they do say, you'll know it when you see it. And I feel like this one, I don't see it.
Well, I'm glad you said those three ones, because I had thought the axolotl was particularly weird, not for its transformation, but because of the perspective of the axolotl. Yeah. You know, the protagonist feeling themselves change and their reaction or like lack of reaction to that. The weirdness was in the emotion there. And you know what? In the same way with the salamander, it wasn't that she became a salamander. It's that everyone kept trying to kill her, you know? Everyone was trying to, I mean, at one point, like some eels pull her arms off. So she gets chased around by these villagers who call her a witch. And then, you know, later her arms get pulled off by an eel. Like, but there's never a sense of like, oh, this is terrible. Oh my gosh. The weirdness was in the disjunction of her emotional reaction. So thinking through that emotion was the weirdness of those two. I might maybe point to the emotions being the weirdness here. Like the fact that all of these fantastic things are happening, but there's no reaction to the fantasticness of it. There's only an emotional reaction that in some way it doesn't live up to expectations, or that has created some kind of conflict with the mother. Or, I mean, think of, she digs a big pit in the ground and builds a house over it and tells her mom to live in there. The mom doesn't fall in the pit, so she lights the house on fire. She's tried to kill her mother twice in the span of a paragraph. You know what I mean? But there's no like feeling of like malice or wrath. You know what I mean? It's a different kind of emotion. So I think that might be what I put my pen in for this one, that the emotional presentation of this is specifically what generates the weird.
Do you think though is it the way you're saying, the emotional presentation? So the way the emotions are presented through strange transformations, is that what's weird about it? Because you could look at any other story and say, oh, it's got a lot of emotions in it. It could be weird. Is it the fact that it's tied emotions with weird transformation or weird, crazy, surreal situation? Is that what's the weird thing about it?
I think that the situations could be anything, but specifically it's the disconnect between the emotions that we're seeing and the events that are described. I think that's the weirdness of it. Anytime there's like a mismatch between how the narrator is presenting something and what we as a reader might expect that emotional presentation to be, I think that's kind of like a weird generator. So like, for example, recently we read Ted Chiang's The Life Cycle of Software Objects. And aside from the SF plot about these sentient AI beings, there's a kind of romance plot. There's a desire story. Doesn't really culminate. But the narration of this book is told in the flattest, most affectless prose, completely lacks empathy for the characters. It's like reading a manual for a toaster. And I mean that in a really good way because it's clearly intentional. This is the style. But it's describing yearning and it's describing envy and jealousy and desire, but it's doing it as though we are assembling furniture from IKEA and reading the instructions. So that is an example of the mismatch between voice and what is being described. And I can't think of a story off the top of my head, but if you could think of like, I don't know, like a war story, for example, blood and wrath and anger and murder and, all of these big emotions that you can imagine in a play. But if the narrator that's presenting it is doing it in this completely flat tone, or if they're doing it in a completely like gushing tone, like imagine a serial killer describing their time in World War II and how much fun they're having. They're in ecstasy. That would be weird. That would be a generator of that weird feeling. I think this might not be in the list of Ann and Jeff VanderMeer. I might just be, you might be seeing this straight out of the oven right now, but this is what I think. This is how I'm kind of chalking up this work.
I think we got to read Clockwork Orange. My speech is just leaving me tonight. I don't know. We have to read Clockwork Orange eventually and see, because that feels kind of similar to what you're describing about someone taking pleasure in something that should not be taking pleasure in and writing in a style that is doesn't fit. It's not the style. It's in the wrong style. Since you mentioned furniture and the style. I'm wondering too, it reminds me a lot now of Bruno Schultz's story about the sanatorium, which we were thinking, okay, there is a weird narration style where it's almost like the inner workings of the brain are changing reality as it unfolds out in front of them. Kind of like that Spinozan idea of the reality coming out of one big consciousness. It seems like Bruno Schultz's narrator is producing reality as he thinks it. But this feels in a way similar. It's just flipping a lot more. Because there are long passages that seem to be almost not surreal at all. And then slowly the surreal works its way back in. And it's like not forgiving your mother, not reconciling with your mother, if you can't, then it's going to turn into magical realism again. There's a great moment where she says, one day my mother packed my things in a grip and taking me by the hand, walked me to the jetty, placed me on board a boat in care of the captain. We go on for a long time and it's all normal. And then she says she got off and she sees a woman exactly with feet just like hers. And she realizes, oh, it's my mother. So her mother has sent her off somewhere to arrive where her mother is again. And then we get to another, there's like little, what do you call this, ellipses in between different passages. So after the end of this passage, we get another one and it becomes like her mother becomes like a mountain almost. She becomes very, very small again, and it's like her mother's holding her again, but her mother's also gigantic, it feels like. But it feels like the Bruno Schultz story where he says, I might have had two fathers, because his father is already dead, but the doctor in that story at the sanatorium has reset the clock, so his father's alive again. And he comes to his father at different stages in pre-death, before death, after death, where his father is sometimes very sick, sometimes his father is very healthy. He sees a man who is a man, and then a dog, and then a man, and then a dog. It feels similar to that Bruno Schultz story, but even more completely leaving behind reality.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you that Bruno Schultz is a good comparison point, especially because of that complicated relationship with the parent figure, which is kind of bleeding through everything that happens. Yeah, that's a good point. Bob, I want to talk to you about Jamaica Kincaid's career, which I did a little bit of research on. Because following the publication of this, Kincaid released a novel called Annie John, which is a novel composed of interrelated stories that chart a mother-daughter relationship in Antigua. And then after that, Kincaid published a book called The Autobiography of My Mother. So, like, from what I can gather, there is book after book after book after book, story after story after story after story of kind of plumbing the depths of her dissatisfaction with her mother. And, you know, when I heard her talk, she was like, it's very clear to me that my mother never loved me, she says in interviews. And this feeling to me, I think, like, as a reader, I don't know if other people feel like this. And I'm sure there are people watching this who are much more familiar with Kincaid's work, but it's very shocking to me. I think it's one of the most shocking things I've ever seen, for someone to dedicate their whole life, their whole career, to pinpoint a single person and be like, they are, they're the problem. I have this much against them. Have you ever seen anything like this before? I mean, I'm struggling here.
I'm not sure, but it makes me think now, maybe you've hit the nail on the head of why it's weird. A big part of the weird fiction is obsession. And, if it's the author's obsession to have, to be obsessed with their mother, and then this character seems to also be obsessed with their mother, if your obsession starts to change reality in the way that it's changing reality into not just fairy tale, not just picture book, but this whole upturning of everything that is established in one reality to the next reality, asterisk by asterisk. If the obsession here is what is carrying this story, that seems to relate well to the weird too.
Yeah. Yeah. Without knowing anything about their relationship, though, I do feel like I can't help but feel, I don't know if it's empathy or I don't know if it's pity for the mother, like it feels so emotionally complicated. In a way, actually, I'm kind of reminded of Knausgaard's books, where he writes painstaking details about all of his family members and everyone he's ever known since high school. And he doesn't hold anything back. He spills everyone's secrets, and he puts all of their real names in the books, and he got sued by several people. He gets
sued by his uncle.
Yeah. So it's like, I don't know. Like, this is one of those things, like, does literature necessarily have to come at the cost of betrayal, And I don't know who's, I'm not trying to put fault on anyone. I don't know anything about their relationship. I don't know, I'm not trying to say one person's fault or the other person. I'm just saying like, yeah, like it's just interesting to see that at the heart of literature, that kind of maybe betrayal. I don't know what other word to describe it,
This is really interesting to me, and I want to see it more, or see how other weird authors relate their life to the weird fiction, how much fiction really influences their life. I'd like to see that as we move forward.
Absolutely. I think that we're going to see lots of things as we move closer and closer to today. Yeah. Talk to you later, Bob.
Talk to you later, Zach.
Oof.